Here's an email from Joe. This is a pretty good one. It's about Bigfoot. Back in the 1980s, when my uncle was living in Davie, Florida, he was driving to my aunt's house one evening for a family get-together. It was nearing dusk, and at the time there were parts of Davie that were still undeveloped, though city planners had already established traffic lights on the outskirts ahead of the urban sprawl that was advancing toward the outlying pastures and wooded areas that framed the town. My uncle was stopped at one such intersection when in the distance he thought he saw a creature covered with brown cinnamon-colored hair stroll across the road. It was walking upright like a man. Its gait was enormous, and it seemed to cross the road in 2 strides. From my uncle's vantage point, he estimated it to be 8 feet tall, with wide shoulders and lengthy arms resembling a gorilla. It had some sort of animal carcass slung over its shoulder. The creature strode over a 5-foot-tall barbed wire fence that separated the pasture from the road and cleared it effortlessly. That's a hard word for me to say. Effortlessly. It stopped briefly to lock eyes with my uncle, staring him down as if to establish its dominance. It let out a roar that my uncle felt in his chest, like the low rumble of a stereo speaker blasting from a passing car. The creature turned and disappeared into the woods. When my uncle arrived at the get-together, he pushed past us toward the bathroom, where we could hear the muffled sounds of him throwing up. I only heard the story in bits and pieces. I was a boy at the time, and the family felt the details of my uncle's experience might be too graphic for young ears. They sent me off to a spare bedroom. I quickly found an ashtray and cupped it to the closed door so I could eavesdrop on their conversation. It was obvious to me that my uncle had seen something, but the members of the family thought otherwise. To them, his story was a joke, something closer to an April Fool's prank. They weren't falling for it. They mocked him until I heard him shout, "If you guys are going to keep this up, I'm out of here." And I heard the front door slam and the sound of tires squealing. I didn't see my uncle until the next day. No one can hurt you like family. Whatever he saw that night, my uncle never brought it up again. Years went by, and the incident was largely forgotten by all but me. When I got him to open up about that night some 20 years later, every detail remained just as both of us remembered. Whoa, what a great story. This is like I don't even know how to describe it. It's because it's early in the morning and I'm not thinking clear at the moment, although I do have a hot cup of coffee in my hand. It hadn't kicked in yet. But this is a good story because this man saw something. He came back to his family. He pleaded with them pretty much to believe him, and they just made fun of him. They thought it was a prank, and they mocked him, and he finally just says, "I'm out of here." You know, that happens a lot of times with these incidents. I don't know why families seem to... I have people in my family that way, and they make fun of other people in the family for some kind of idea. It doesn't have to be a story like this. It could be just... I'll give you an example. It would be like me saying, "Hey, I'm going to start a YouTube channel and tell weird stories." I got laughed at for that from people in my family. I don't know what it is about family. It's funny how we do that. And if you are not one of these people who can break out of that and follow your passions and follow, just live your own life and do what you want to do, then you're always kind of closed up in that box that family members put you in. You never do anything, and eventually you become like them. And if you do, you will be the one making fun of your kids for having an idea of doing something unconventional, or that would be unconventional to the way they see the world. And so that's my little commentary, and maybe an encouragement to people. I tell you what I did. I just forgot what people in my family were telling me, and I knew I loved doing this, and I just kept doing it, and it's been a little over 4 years now, and I'm just doing what I love. I love sharing these stories and reading these stories and producing some level of quality in a video so that people can sit around the dinner table or lay in bed at night, or truck drivers on a long haul, or people on a vacation. Those are all the people I kind of envision listening to these stories. And it's kind of a mind-numbing thing that you actually pay attention to. I love doing it, and I don't feel like I'm doing anyone a favor. It's mainly for me. It's mainly for my enjoyment and my gratification. But if other people enjoy it, it encourages you to keep doing it. And I love it. And so I don't know why this story sparked that conversation, because it's early in the morning and that's just the first thing that popped in my head. So I'll quit rambling. Let's move on to the rest of the podcast. How about that? My name's Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid YouTube channel, also found out on the podcast network or on any podcast app under the name What If It's True Podcast. Look us up. Got 4 stories in this podcast. You just heard one. 2 of the next stories are going to be kind of weird. They're some of the weirdest stories I've ever heard. But if you send them to me and they're not too wacky, I'm going to put them in a podcast because I like weird stories. So thank you for joining me. Let's get rolling with the rest of this podcast. I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. Okay, here's an email from a man who doesn't say whether to use his name or not. Blah, blah, blah. You know the story. This is actually 3 or 4 stories in one email, and I'm gonna try to hit all of them. Anyway, I'll quit blabbering. It's a pretty long email, but it's pretty good. It's about Bigfoot. I knew a real mountain man once. He's passed away now, but he lived in northern New York in the Adirondack Mountains. Most of his life, he made his living hunting and trapping, and sometimes he'd augment that working construction. Like most old-timers, he was full of stories about hunting and trapping, and he told them in a way that made me want to sit and listen to him for hours. One of the stories he told was about something he called the funny bear. I doubt he'd ever heard of Bigfoot, so that's what he called it. He was always telling strange and interesting stories, but even he thought this one was especially strange. It happened sometime back in the 1950s when he was a major deer poacher. He was in one of his favorite tree stands at the start of one of his nightly missions. It overlooked a shallow valley where there was a swamp full of tag alders. He'd shot a lot of deer there. It was early in the night, just before it got too dark to see, when he caught sight of a funny-looking bear walking down the middle of the valley on his 2 back legs and using its front arms to push the tag elders aside as it worked its way through the thick brush. He didn't see its front, only its back, but he couldn't get over how odd it was to see a bear on its 2 hind legs like that. He told me that story way back in the 1970s, and for years I never gave it a second thought. Not until I heard about Bigfoot and started doing my own research into the subject. I have since received my degrees in chemistry and biology and spent many years out in the woods all over North America, as well as Central America and Asia. And I've seen and heard about every creature that exists. I know their signs and calls, and I know that bears don't walk on their hind legs for more than a few steps. They spend most of their time on all 4s. Looking back at this story, I can only conclude that he saw a Bigfoot walking away from him through the valley that day. Another man I know, who has also made his living in the woods for the past 50 years, is a friend of mine who is a tree surveyor. He often told me that he's seen some strange things out there where there are no roads and no one to run into. Once I asked him what the strangest thing he had ever seen was, and this is what he told me. He hesitated for a minute before he spoke. I'm sure he was debating as to whether or not to tell me the story. I could see the mental debate in his eyes. Finally, he said that there was this one time when he was in an area in the Adirondacks where they were cutting new roads so they could get into a new area that had not been cut for over 100 years. He doubted anyone had been back there in all that time. It was in a remote part of the state. He hiked in several miles when he crested a ridge and saw off in the distance something lying on a fallen tree log. It looked like it was sleeping, but he couldn't make out what it was. He got to within 50 yards of it when it jumped up and ran on two legs down into the valley. He was sure it was on two legs like a man, but for the life of him, he could not identify the animal. He stood there and watched it until it disappeared, and then studied it for a minute. Since it was running away from him, he decided it didn't pose a threat, so he continued his work. I don't believe in Bigfoot, he told me, but if I had to describe what that was, that is what I would say it is. Well, I've had my own encounters with what I'm sure is Bigfoot. I grew up on 275 acres on a farm that was connected to thousands of acres of state land. It was absolutely a kid's paradise. Between the farm animals and the wild game and the endless woods and fishing in the river that ran through our property, I was in heaven. For the most part, we never experienced anything unusual on the farm. There was that one time when one of our dogs disappeared after a long night of hearing what sounded like wolves calling. There weren't supposed to be any wolves in that part of the country at that time. And then there was the time I found one of my traps smashed to pieces like something big had picked it up and tore it in half. We didn't attribute any of that to Bigfoot, though, and it never crossed our minds. When I got old enough, I joined the Navy and I saw the world, and when my enlistment was up, I came back to the farm. It was 1990. I took a job at a local Sears store. We were no longer farming by then. Dad kept the land to grow hay for his horses, and we used it to hunt on. During the 1995 deer season, I was out in the back 100 acres where it meets up with the state forest, and I was hunting along an old railroad bed. An hour before dark, I saw something jump up 100 yards ahead of me, and I recognized it was a big wolf. They were still rare in the area. I didn't want a pack of wolves harming my dad's horses, and I sure didn't want them running the deer off our land, so I shot it. Even as I pulled the trigger, I was making plans to have it mounted. But after I hit it, it ran into the brush, and I never found it. I blew a hamburger-sized hole out of its side, but it kept going. Well, I figured it wasn't going to go very far. It was getting late, and light was limited, so I decided to come back the next morning and track it. I came back around noon the next day. His trail from the railroad bed was easy to find, and I followed it into the thick brush, and he took me on a merry chase through the woods and underbrush and into the swamps and back up onto the railroad bed, and finally ending up a few hundred yards east of where I had shot it in some of the thickest brush you can imagine. It was a thicket so dense that no one ever ventured in there. Even the cows and horses stay out of that place. That's probably why the wolf chose it. He must have figured that I wouldn't follow him in there, but I did. And I had to crawl on my hands and knees to get through the tangled mass of brambles, with only the occasional drop of blood on a leaf to guide me. Well, by now it was getting late, and I was starting to worry that the wolf had set a trap for me, and he was waiting somewhere in that jungle for me to take a wrong turn so it could pounce and take its revenge before it died. And in the back of my mind, I always worried that a friend of mine who had permission to hunt that land might be at his tree stand not far from there, and if he heard me moving around in that thick brush, he might think I was a deer and take a shot at me. I barely had time to process that thought when I heard something moving 30 yards to the north. It's got to be that wolf, I thought, and immediately I started working my way toward him to get a shot. As I moved in that direction, it moved further away, and I began to think it was a deer, not a wolf. But then it started to circle me, and I couldn't imagine either an injured wolf or a deer doing that. I decided I had to know what it was, so I stood up. It wasn't easy in that mass of twisted branches and thorns, but I managed to get to my feet and I began to move in the direction of the sound as quickly as I could. Whatever this thing was, it was staying far enough ahead to evade my line of sight, and it was moving farther away from me, but it was still circling me. It occurred to me that it sounded like another person walking on two legs, and the hair began to stand up on the back of my neck as an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Maybe it's Scott, I told myself, thinking of the friend who had a nearby tree stand. Maybe he heard me in here and he's trying to get a look at me to see if I'm a deer. Well, that didn't explain why he'd back away or circle around me. He'd be trying to move in so he could get a good shot. I decided that breaking my silence was better than being shot, so I called out to him, "Scott, is that you?" And I got no answer. Well, maybe it wasn't Scott. Maybe it was somebody else, somebody trespassing on our land. Either way, my main priority was not to be shot, so I called out again, "Hey, if there's anyone over there, I've got a gun. I don't want to shoot you, and I sure don't want to get shot." And still I got no answer. But it didn't move away either. A wild animal would have been startled by the sound of a human voice. I tried to move closer again, and it stayed back but continued to circle me. And then I heard a loud huff. It was like an animal snorting out a big puff of air. I decided whatever it was that it did not want me to see it, and I was thinking maybe it would be better if I didn't see it, and I turned northwest then and headed back toward the old railroad bed where my truck was sitting, and I got the hell out of there. I ran into Scott the next day, and I asked him if he'd gone hunting the day before. He said he'd had to work late and he didn't get a chance to go. Years later, people in my town began hearing screams coming from the swamps that were nothing like anything they'd heard before. The local paper reported that someone thought it was a Bigfoot. Well, I think back to that day, and I was crawling around in those brambles, and I wonder if that's what was circling me. A dozen years later, I had moved to the next town over. The house I'd purchased sat on 10 acres of land between the swamps that were a part of the larger swamp system that begins at the foot of the Adirondacks and stretches across the St. Lawrence Valley. A brook runs 30 yards to the left of my house. It's a natural track for the local animal life there, and I've seen turkeys, deer, bears, moose, bobcats, mountain lions, and other wildlife. I also have many deer that come into my backyard that I've given up on growing apple trees, and they eat all the leaves off the trees before they have a chance to grow. I had lived there a few years when I happened to notice some large rocks in my backyard as if someone were throwing them there to try and ruin my lawnmower. Several times I had to pick up the rocks out of my lawn. For a minute I thought maybe it was the neighbor, but I had no idea why he would do such a thing. We were good friends. Besides, my neighbor lived 700 feet down the road. Well, this went on for several weeks before it stopped. There was never any reason for it to start, nor was there ever a reason for it to stop. But all that happened, and it was strange. Later that year, when my brother was visiting from New York City, we were both up late one night playing cards on our computers. My game of choice is World of Warcraft. I was sitting there playing with my headphones on when I began to hear an annoying sound that I took to be a glitch in the game. I would hear it for a minute and then it would stop. After a 10-minute period, it would begin again and got louder. That was when I realized it wasn't coming from the game. It was coming from somewhere out behind my house. It was late in the year, and I had all the windows and doors closed and the heat on, but this was loud enough that I was still able to hear it even with my headphones on. Well, I took them off and I stepped out onto the back porch to try to identify the sound. And it was like a woman being strangled to death in the woods 100 yards into the swamp. There were no roads leading to that place, and there was no reason for anyone to be back there or a way for them to hike back there even if they wanted to. And furthermore, it was after midnight. I have extensive experience in the woods. I am familiar with nearly every sound out there. This sound was nothing like anything I had ever heard before. It sounded like a woman, but the pitch and the volume were that of an animal. Whatever was making that sound had the lung capacity of a 2,000-pound bull, and I've since read and heard of others who described the same noise. I even heard a recording on a Bigfoot show that sounded exactly what I had heard that night. If someone is hoaxing this sound, they must have the resources to travel coast to coast and a natural skill for finding the most remote and strange places to play it. But as a scientist, I can't honestly say it was a Bigfoot. I never saw it. However, I can't stop myself from asking what else it could have been. And that's the end of his email. And that was an excellent story. This guy's got stories from friends, stories from coworkers, experiences of his own. He's never seen a Bigfoot, but all of the evidence that he's pulling together and kind of connecting the dots is all leading to, I'm sure, a Bigfoot. And I thought it was a great story, and I appreciate him sending it. Thank you. This is an email I got from David back in 2020, and I'm just getting to it. It's pretty long. It's a series of events in his life and his family's life when they lived in California. And I think you all will enjoy hearing this. Some of it's kind of creepy and some of it's really cool. But here's what David writes. My father related a story to us as kids that when he was a boy, he and his grandpa were looking at logging areas that my great-grandpa was working. They had arrived early in the morning and went straight to the logging road, which was fresh cut the afternoon before. Out of the old-growth forest came these huge footprints into the muddy road. They walked around the bulldozer and they went back into the forest. My dad said they looked human, but huge, and he believed someone had hoaxed them. The local news or newspaper had showed up and did a story on it. We've looked into that, but we couldn't find anything. When we would question him about it, he would get agitated and change the subject. Later in his life, he and my uncles were camping out doing some black-tailed deer hunting. Sometime after dark, when the fire was starting to die down, they were startled by the sounds of monkey-type screams coming from all directions around the camp. He stated that they couldn't tell if they were in the trees or tall enough to sound like it. They stoked the fire to brighten up the area around them, but they saw nothing. They then packed up and left in a hurry. This happened in the old-growth redwood and Douglas fir forests near Eureka, California. When I was 1, we moved from there to Weaverville, California, where me, my 2 brothers, and 3 sisters grew up. When I was 8 or 9, we moved to an area 8 miles west of Weaverville called Slaughter Pond. The mobile home was situated way back off the pond, and it was wilderness behind our place. The owners told my parents that a huge black bear would come around and cause trouble now and then, and to keep an eye out. During the time we lived there, we would sit and listen to these screams, and it sounded like a woman being murdered or assaulted. My mother's eyes would water up, and she would tell my dad that a woman needed help, but my dad would blame the sounds on a fox or a bobcat or a mountain lion. We all knew the screams were way too loud for those critters, as it came from the bluffs way above us. Then one day my older brother, who was 15 years old at the time, came running into the house excitedly, telling my mother about these man-like footprints he found while exploring around. His face showed the fear, and he wouldn't accept our mom's explanation that it was a bear stepping in its own tracks. He said the tracks were so far apart, and it looked like it walked on 2 legs. He also motioned with his hands how large each print was. I'm guessing they were 18 to 20 inches long. Maybe a month or 2 later, while lying in bed next to my older brother, I was awake and he was sleeping. We had a batch of kittens that stayed in our room, which was located at the end of the double-wide trailer. While laying there playing with the kittens, I noticed that there were 3 that were still on the windowsill, and they sat frozen in a puffed-up stance, and they were all staring out the window. Their heads moved together, watching something move outside, and then I heard footsteps coming toward the house, getting louder and louder. I could feel the bed vibrate from the weight, and it was followed by a sound as it went around the trailer to the other side. It was silent for a second before I felt the mobile home shudder, and I heard a cracking sound come from across the hallway from my closed bedroom door. Well, I snuck from bed and I turned the doorknob as quietly as I could. The knob made a very slight click sound, and suddenly I heard the thing running the way it had come, back around the trailer. It was only 3 or 4 steps for it to be all the way from one side of the trailer to the other. I ran by the pantry on my way to my parents' room at the other end of the trailer, and I thought the cracking sound had come from the pantry area. When I got into Mom and Dad's bed, they told me it was just cats fighting outside. Well, I knew better, but I went to sleep anyway. The next day, when my mother picked me up from school, my older brother asked if I remembered what happened last night. I said, yeah. He said, wait until we get home. When we got home, all 6 kids and our parents walked to the side that I heard the breaking sound come from. There, 8 to 10 feet up at the top of the pantry door, which was a piece of plywood screwed over the opening because the door was missing, were scratch marks where it pushed the plywood to the point that it was caved in. I remember my mother, who was 5 foot 10 inches tall, craning her head up to look at it and asking my dad what kind of bear could reach that high. Looking back now, it all fits. I think I know what was going on there, including why the door was missing in the first place. We moved from there to a property we had just bought near Trinity Lake, California. It's a wild and wooded area with few people. Our closest neighbors were friendly but a little different. They used to tell us how they fed a family of Bigfoots there off the deck every night. The dad, the mom, and the little one, they all fed it. We didn't act like we didn't believe them to their face, but we really didn't. I was about 9 or 10 years old at this time, and I slept on a hideaway bed in the living room with my younger brother. One night I woke up feeling like I had been choked and I could barely breathe. And again, I went into Mom and Dad's room. Mom let me slip in with them. I was on one side of the bed, Mom was in the middle, and Dad was on the other side. Sometime later, I was still trying to get back to sleep, and I was lying on my back with my eyes closed when I noticed through my eyelids that I was seeing light flickering. It was like sitting in front of a campfire at night with your eyes closed. At first, I paid attention to see if I was imagining it, but I could see it for sure as the light changed and danced through my eyelids. When I opened my eyes, the room was already turning a reddish color, and I could see the source moving about through the house. What confused me is that I could see the light through the walls as it seemed to go room to room. Finally, I reached our room, and this red ball of light came through the wall at the top of the door. It came to a stop, and it looked like half a ball was in, and the other half was on the other side of the wall. Well, I was sitting up and staring at it by now. It never made a sound, and it had no smell, and the ball looked like lava or plasma, moving and turning in a perfect circle. It was slightly smaller than a basketball and had a purple aura that was maybe 4 feet in diameter, with big electric white-colored sparkles that shot out from the edge of the red into the purple, but it faded out when they got to the edge of the purple area. The whole thing was like fireworks and sparklers, but again there was no smoke, smell, or sound. It was so beautiful and so strange. I could see clearly because of the light, so I put my hand on my mom's hip and I said, "Mom, look at the red light," while pointing at it with my right hand. I looked back at the ball and it was just sitting there, so I began and said, "Mom, look at that red light." I was trying to wake her up. She was facing away from me on her left side, and I was looking at her side profile. I was still pointing and had my left hand on her hip when she started to lift her head to look. And when she laid her head back down, I heard her voice tell me, "You're dreaming, son. Go back to sleep." The problem was, even as a child, I realized that her mouth never moved. I could see it clearly. I turned back to the orb and I said, "I'm not seeing things, Mom. It's right there." 3 seconds from the moment I stopped speaking those words, all memory of the room stopped. I started to come to, which was a lot like waking up from surgery, but becoming aware much quicker. I was still pointing with my right hand, and I was still looking in the direction I was on the bed. And I started to turn my head to the left, and I was looking out what looked like a glass window, except it was far from the floor to the ceiling. I stared out, and I saw stars that were so clear, and I knew I was no longer on Earth. As I continued turning my head left, I could feel someone holding my left hand, and I assumed it was my mother. My eyes saw my pajama pattern on my sleeve, and I moved up my arm to my hand. Holding my hand gently was a hairy hand with a black wrinkled skin, and it was red-haired on the back of its hand with black fingernails that had white streaks like ours do, and they came to a thick point. Nowadays, I would compare them to vampire-type nails. My eyes then went from our hands up its arms, and I looked right into its eyes. I don't know if it was a he, but it felt like it was. He was looking down at me with the whites showing in his eyes and the look of surprise on its face. He was about as tall as an average man. My eyes then followed his other hand, which was being held by another hand. A big one was holding his hand, but looking down at me, also with the same surprised look the younger one had. This was a female, and she must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, and holding her hand was the daddy, and he was a good head and a half taller than the mother. All three were auburn red color, and they looked just like Patty. And this is the same county that the Patterson-Gimlin film was taken. Anyway, he was looking at me with the same look as the other two. So myself and the smaller one were side by side, and the parents were side by side, but on our left and facing us. Then my eyes moved from them to the right a little, and standing side by side with their backs to the wall were 2 alien beings. The first one was a mantis-looking thing, and it was at least 9 feet tall. It had what looked like burnt-colored bone cheeks, and it did not appear to have skin on its face. It seemed to be all bone, like an exoskeleton. It resembled a red ant in color and shape, but like a praying mantis. It had oval-shaped eyes that wrapped around its head and were black. The second one looked like an alien in the movie Signs, or like a tall gray alien. It was also 9 feet tall. It had a big round head and silver round eyes like copper sunglasses, and its skin was a light blue color. They were looking down, and as my eyes moved from them to what they were looking at, I saw the little gray alien standing in the middle of the room looking at them. His head was bobbing like it was talking to them, but it wasn't saying anything. It then turned its head toward me, and I looked into its black almond-shaped eyes. We were pretty close to the same height. The next moment, I was still in the waking up from surgery state, but walking up the hallway toward the kitchen with a voice in my head telling me to drink pickle juice. Well, I drank some, and I must have fallen asleep because that's all I remember. Later in my life, I find it of great interest that our neighbors talked about the 3 Bigfoots that they would feed, and then bam! 3 of them abducted along with me. In 1982, my parents separated and my mother moved into a place in Weaverville. My sister stayed with my mom. My brother and I stayed with my dad most of the time. My sister Cindy went for a walk to get away from the other girls who were arguing. She walked into the woods behind the house and was there a long time. She sat down next to a water puddle and was playing with the leaves in the water. And she began to sense and then hear something in the trees not far away. When she looked up, she saw a huge Bigfoot coming out of the tree line, walking with a purpose toward her, looking right into her eyes, with a look on its face like it wanted to kill her. She was frozen in fear. and the angry Bigfoot approached suddenly, another one she hadn't seen, and stepped out in front of the other one, stopping the charge. My sister jumped up and started running home. And one of the Squatches roared, and she said it was horrible, and it still haunts her today. Around that same time, my dad worked at a lumber mill, but was working with a family friend logging during downtimes. They had just cut a road into an old-growth Douglas fir forest that evening. At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, they pulled up to the site near the bulldozer, ready to fuel up for the day. And at daybreak, they got out and walked to the dozer and noticed huge tracks walking around and around the dozer. Then they went into the dense old-growth forest. There were no vehicle tracks or human tracks except theirs, leaving the night before and returning that morning. There are no other roads there, so they ruled out people. My brother and I hunted deer in there many years without any problems. My dad passed away about 5 years ago, so I can't question him about his brushes with Bigfoot. He avoided talking about the subject anyway. In 2004, my wife and I and our 2 sons moved to Coos Bay, Oregon. After some years, they both married and they moved out. We live in an old house with 12 acres, and we are caretakers for the old couple next door who own the property. If all the other stuff sounds crazy to you, then this is almost too hard for me to even admit. But what I'm about to tell you is true. I was stacking wood against the front of our house one afternoon during the fall of 2017. I was off in another world while stacking and had grabbed an armload and was turning toward the house. A loud squawking sound jolted my attention to the sky, and there, soaring north to south, right over and along the little ridge beside my house, was a huge black bird. It had a giant crest on its head, and its wings looked like skin with sort of fur or maybe some feathers. It had a long rat-like tail with a ball-type shape at the end of it, and it soared for 5 seconds and covered 100 yards, and then took one slow, deliberate flap and soared on its way toward Highway 101. Well, I watched in disbelief and shock for 20 or 30 seconds until it went out of view. And as weird as this sounds, I think it was a living pterodactyl. It was the size of a commuter plane, 25 or 30 foot wingspan. It was longer than 30 to 35 feet. I was 100 yards from it at its closest and would not have noticed it if it hadn't squawked. I think it saw the road crew green reflective coat I had on, and it reacted with that call, because I had just come into view from behind the rhododendron in the yard. So there's the strangest event in my life, and I still can't believe it myself. So to all you doubters out there, I get it. I probably wouldn't believe it either. Okay, we're 18 to 20 minutes into his email, and I'm only about a third of the way through it. So I'm going to save the rest of his email for another time. I want to move to some other stories and let some other people be heard. But this guy goes on and on. It's like page after page after page of weird things that happen to him. And I guess that, some people just draw this kind of stuff, I guess. I don't know. I can't imagine. He's been almost abducted by aliens. He's had Bigfoot encounters, and he has seen a pterodactyl with a 30-foot wingspan fly 100 yards over his house. I mean, this guy has seen everything from top to bottom in the paranormal or cryptid type field, and that's pretty crazy. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it right there, but we'll get back to it at another time. All right, here's another really weird story or set of stories. That's kind of that's the flavor of this podcast. It's really, really, really strange stories. This one is, well, he doesn't say whether to use his name or not, and I'm not really sure what happens in this story, but I'm going to read it anyway, so you guys will have to decide. Back in May of 2004, I was in the middle of a bitter separation. During our last raging battle, I threw my hands in the air and decided to head to Texas. I had a brother and a sister living there, and I figured I'd be a lot better off near them than I would be near my ex. I got a job right away, and I managed to save up enough money to rent a third-floor walk-in apartment in Bedford. My brother was a lot of help in getting the place furnished. He found a bunch of furniture for me at yard sales, including a $20 350-pound fold-out couch bed that he left at the foot of the stairs for me to carry up, alone. Bless his beautiful potato head. It was a Friday night. I had been in the apartment for a week by then, and I was sleeping on a pallet on the floor. My job at the cabinet shop was hard work, and my body wasn't reacting well to the new sleeping arrangement. I took one look at that couch and considered for a minute pulling it out and sleeping in it right there. And then I decided to head up to my apartment and brave one more night on the floor. The couch could sit where it was. It wasn't long before I was crawling into my little nest on the floor and doing my best to find an elusive comfort zone, and somehow I managed to drift off to sleep. It felt like only a few minutes later, and I opened my eyes again, but I wasn't on the floor anymore. And I tried to look around, but I couldn't see any part of me. Something was holding me firmly in place, and I couldn't see what it was or feel what it was, and I couldn't move. I was lying with my head slightly elevated and looking down at a massive silvery blue room. As I stared down the length of this long room, the far wall slid open and a tall blue man stepped through. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought I should have been throwing a fit, but that wasn't how I felt. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and I had been turned on. Every system of my body felt like it was in overdrive. There was this energy coming from somewhere that filled me with bliss. The best way I can describe it is a feeling like a new parent has when they hold their baby for the first time. Whatever was holding me in place brought me to a standing position as the blue being walked straight toward me. My head was pushed downward until I was looking at where my feet should have been, but they weren't there. After a few seconds, it became apparent that something was controlling my entire body, except for my eyes. Well, questions formed in my pea brain as I struggled to understand what was happening, and it was then that I realized I wasn't breathing, nor could I hear anything. At the same time, I felt like I was in complete control. It was weird. Suddenly, out of nowhere, these two big blue feet, 3 times the size of mine, stepped in front of me, and that energy that I was feeling multiplied by 10,000 times. It was pulsating over me in wave after wave, as if someone was pulling the softest ever bed sheets over my entire body. I was staring down at those big feet that I noticed didn't have any toenails, and a feeling of calm and comfortable when I noticed more illuminating light reflecting off of me onto him. My head was being lifted now until I found myself staring at the blue man. He was at least 13 feet tall. He was built slim but proportioned right. He was dressed in old-school sandals and a biblical robe, and his hair was long and curly, and he wore a beard. Most of his face, except for the beard, was covered by a metallic shield, and it reminded me of Optimus Prime. He tilted his face to look into mine, and beside the mask I could see a human face staring at me. Then he turned to my left and went to the wall, and he raised his hand and waved it across a spot that made it a bubble and then opened up to reveal a black 8-foot by 8-foot opening. I wanted to say something, but I had no mouth, ears, or nose. All I could do was look around with my eyes. I was turned and moved forward toward the black opening so I could see into it. It was all a black space except for a little orb that passed by, and then another, until there were what looked like fields of those little white lights moving around in there. Then they slowed down, and I realized they were not the ones moving. We were the ones moving. We stopped in front of one of the orbs and began moving in closer and closer until we were touching it. I was able to look inside the light orb now, and it too was a black space. In the center was a tiny glow that I recognized as a person sleeping, and I turned my eyes to look at the being standing next to me, and I realized the vast difference in how the things looked between the two. When I was looking at the person sleeping, it looked normal, but when I looked at the blue being, it was beyond 4K. The only way I can describe it is that it was like a super HD, and that still doesn't cover it. The blue man bent down and looked through the black window at the sleeping person, which drew my attention back to him as well, and I soon realized that I was looking at myself sleeping. I looked so peaceful and beautiful. I've had people tell me my face looks like a train wreck in a pumpkin patch, so seeing myself as looking beautiful is saying something. As we watched, something else manifested in my bedroom. It wasn't a person, it was a big black triangular monster covered in muscles that was digging like a dog at my throat. There was some sort of invisible shield between the beast and the sleeping me that seemed to help me to remain calm while it tore at my throat with its long, powerful claws. And then it turned its head and looked back up to where we were staring down at it through the window. Its eyes were large and round with a big black pupil, and I could tell it was some kind of lizard creature. The thing looked like it had just been busted, and it was scared. I couldn't see all of its face, but enough to know that it was not its happy face. The three of us were locked in this seeing each other position for half a minute before a flash of light broke our trance, and I turned back toward the blue man to see a smaller being, made entirely of light, begin to form in front of me. It had no face, only two dark spots where there should have been eyes, and I knew that person was me, and the monster faded away. I don't remember anything after that point. The next thing I knew, I was back in my bed. Things got pretty strange for the next several days, but I haven't found the words yet to explain it. Maybe someday I will. And I have absolutely nothing to add or say about that story. That's one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. But this guy apparently seems to remember it all vividly, and I think I'm kind of interested on the words that he has figured out to explain it when he said maybe someday I will. I don't remember when I got this email, but if he's thought about it, let me know. Let me know what you think, sir. It's a good story, though. I appreciate it. Okay, here's a Bigfoot story. I never thought I would want to get to a Bigfoot story, but after the first two, and I'm not sure what order I'm going to put these stories in when I put this podcast together, because if I put the two crazy ones in the front, people will go, "Woo, this is wacky. Maybe I'll go listen to something else." But we'll see. But anyway, I get kind of burnt out on Bigfoot, but I'm kind of glad we got a Bigfoot story here. So let's read it. The writer's name is Terry. I've loved camping ever since I was a Boy Scout, and my favorite campground has always been the Blackwater River State Forest in extreme northwest Florida. It was the spring of 1999, and I was father to two young daughters. Like a good dad, I wanted to share with them my love of the outdoors. We set up camp near a clump of trees on the edge of the forest, and that night we cooked hot dogs, and I taught the girls how to toast marshmallows over a bonfire. I even told a few ghost stories that I remembered from my days as a Boy Scout, when the older boys would scare the bejesus out of us with their tales of monsters and escaped lunatics roaming the woods. With the flashlight casting shadows across my face, I was probably a little too convincing as a storyteller. The girls wanted to go home early the next day, so I dropped them off with their mother and I went back to the campsite for some alone time. I got the fire going and I cranked up the boombox. Oh, don't you, dude, I have to tell you, in a campground, cranking up the boombox, that's a big boom boom no-no. No music in the campground, but maybe you were alone, so I won't get on you too bad. Okay, back to the story. The sounds of CCRs born on the bayou fill the night air. And I was singing along and I thought I heard something strange, but it sure wasn't CCR. I reached for the volume knob and in the quiet, I heard a baby crying. I looked out into the darkness, but I didn't see anything that would suggest that there were others camping nearby. Thank goodness. It's okay to play music then if nobody's nearby. Unless it draws a Bigfoot. So, I'm sorry, back to the story. Suddenly I heard what I thought was a woman screaming. She was in hysterics and clearly scared beyond all reason. I aimed my flashlight into the woods, but I saw nothing, and then I heard branches snapping and breaking just beyond the clump of trees. I grabbed my boombox and doused the fire, and I dove inside my van. I pulled out my .38 and I laid it on my lap. There were footsteps, heavy and ponderous, that seemed to be inching closer. Hoping to scare away who or whatever was out there, I turned on the headlights real quick and I saw a huge shadowy figure scurry into the woods. There was a loud crack and a tree fell near the trail where I'd driven in. Was that this thing trying to trap me? I thought. I decided my mother's only child was not stupid, and I flew out of those woods as fast as that old Dodge van would take me. I returned to the place a few days later. In the daylight, the area seemed peaceful and undisturbed. I saw no trace of a fallen tree. It was really odd. These days, you can no longer drive a vehicle down to that spot. You have to park and make the walk a couple of 100 yards past the clump of trees by the woods where I swore I heard a baby crying and a woman screaming for her dear life. It seems strange that there were no incident reports filed in connection with what I thought I heard that night. The county reported no missing mothers or stolen babies, and nothing involving larger-than-life creatures capable of toppling a tree. It all remains a mystery to me to this day. It's a story that I love to tell my grandchildren on those overnight visits to the Blackwater River State Forest. Well, that was a pretty good story. Man, you turned on that radio and you brought the Bigfoot in, dude. Don't play music when you're out in the woods camping. Just be quiet and listen to what's going on. Put earbuds in or something. This was 1999, so they probably didn't even have earbuds then, but anyway, I'm not really mad. Dude, I'm not really mad at you, but come on. If I was anywhere within a mile of you, I would have heard that music and I would have been pissed off listening to somebody playing a boombox out loud while I'm out trying to enjoy the woods. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Terry, this was a good story. I really appreciate it, and thanks for sending it. Thank you for joining along with this podcast. If you liked it, maybe give me a thumbs up, maybe subscribe, but most of all, come back and listen to the next video. I've got 300 or 400 videos already up. You can go back through my library and listen to stories. I don't know how many hours it is. Hundreds of hours of these kind of stories. You can just click a playlist and just listen and listen and listen and listen. And if you did, I'd appreciate it. And I'm rambling a little bit. And it's cold, and it's dark, and it's at night, and I want to go in. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks.